Wyoming Territory 1879. The wind did not just carry the scent of gun oil and pine, it howled like a living creature, a hungry wolf nipping at the heels of anyone foolish enough to be out after dark. A bitter cold had descended upon the landscape, draping the world in a mantle of white that felt less like peace and more like a shroud. Lillian Hayes knew this cold intimately. It had been her only companion for the last 12 hours. She stumbled through a bank of snow, the thin soles of her old boots offering no protection against the numbing freeze. Her torn blue dress, a flimsy testament to a life she'd fled, offered even less. Her lip was split and swollen, a constant throb of pain that served as a grim reminder of the man she had escaped. Her arms ached with the effort of carrying a silent, heavy boy no older than 6. The boy Leo was a small, warm anchor in a sea of icy dread. Behind them, the trackless snow stretched back to a dark place she never wanted to see again. The dust from the wagon she'd leapt from hours ago was now a frozen memory. That man, the one who'd promised safety, food, and comfort, had delivered only a beating when she had said no. He'd promised her a future, but his eyes held only a past of pain and control. Leo stirred in her arms, his breath a faint puff of fog against her neck. "Mama," he whispered, his voice thin and small. "My stomach hurts." Her legs were shaking, each step a monumental effort. She adjusted Leo on her hip, the boy's weight, a familiar ache, and pressed on toward the flickering yellow light of a livery barn. It glowed in the deepening dusk, a beacon of hope, a fragile promise of warmth and refuge. Inside, the light was soft and golden, a stark contrast to the unforgiving blue outside. A tall, lean man stood with his back to the door, brushing down a magnificent bay gelding. His shirt was dark with sweat clinging to the hard lines of his back and shoulders. The scent of hay leather and horses was a welcome balm. Lillian hesitated at the threshold, the old wood of the doors groaning under her touch. Pride, a tough, unyielding thing, was all that kept her from collapsing in the snow. "I ain't looking for trouble," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. The man, Everett Cole, slowly turned. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, a man in full command of his own space. His eyes the color of a winter sky before the storm moved from the small boy to Lillian's face, lingering on the bruises and the defiant tilt of her chin. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't offer pity. He simply looked. "Looks like you already found it," he said, his voice a low rumble, steady and deep. "Come in before you fall down." She stepped inside and her legs gave way. She didn't fall completely. She slid to her knees, clinging to the doorframe. The warm air rushed over her, a sudden shocking sensation after the prolonged cold. Everett crossed the barn with that same quiet deliberation, pulling a clean wool blanket off a hay bale and laying it out near the corner. Lillian gently set Leo down. The boy curled into a tight ball, burrowing into the soft wool without a sound, a silent testimony to his exhaustion. Everett returned, holding out a tin cup. "Water." She took at her hands, trembling so hard she almost spilled it. She drank slowly the cold water, a jolt of life that steadied her voice and her shaking hands. "Lillian Hayes," she said, watching him warily. "That's Leo. Hasmina." Everett crouched beside the sleeping boy, his gaze gentle as he checked his breathing. "He's a strong one. You run from someone." Lillian's grip on the cup tightened. "I left someone." He nodded once, a gesture of understanding that felt more powerful than 1,000 questions. "That's someone going to come looking." "I hope he does," she said, the words sharper than she intended, an unexpected fire burning in her throat. Everett stood, his tall frame blocking the low-angled lamplight. He studied her face, the split lip, the busted knuckles hidden by her dress, the stubborn defiance in her eyes. "You got somewhere to go." "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "But I'm not begging. I can work." A flicker of something not surprise but respect crossed his face. "I never said you should beg." His gaze was steady, piercing, as if he could see all the battles she had fought and was still fighting. "You want to stay the night, you stay. You and the boy." Lillian's suspicion flared, a familiar shield raising itself against a world that had only ever taken from her. She saw the tall, strong man, the solitude, the quiet power, and her mind, filled with all the old bitter lessons. "Why?" she said, her voice laced with a raw, painful bitterness. "You want me for my body." Everett's brows drew together, a shadow passing over his face. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm, a rock in the wind. "I want you because you don't beg." Lillian stared at him, the accusation dying in her throat. He wasn't a man who flattered or who lied with soft words. "I've seen women cry and scream and fall to pieces," he continued, his words slow and measured. "You walked through hell with a boy in your arms and still asked if there was water before you passed out. That means something to me. A wave of shame washed over her, a tremor shaking her chest. She looked away, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. I can clean stalls, she said, her voice almost inaudible. You will eat first, he said, already walking toward a small back room. There's stew left. That night, Lillian sat by a small fire spoon feeding Leo, who ate with a quiet, desperate hunger. Everett kept watch from the other side of the barn, his shadow long and silent in the lamplight. He did not ask questions. He did not come closer. He just sat there steady and still, letting her breathe, letting the fear and the fight in her begin to settle. She stayed in the barn for 6 days. The 3 days from the original story felt too short. The trauma was still too fresh, the fear too close. 6 days of hard work, of quiet observation, allowed a slow-building trust to take root. Each morning she rose before dawn, her hands raw and aching, and mucked out the stalls with a fierce, almost desperate energy. Leo, his small cough slowly fading, played in the corner with a stick Everett had carved for him from scrap wood. The people in Sundown Ridge, a town carved out of the unforgiving landscape, saw the bruises and the boy and drew their own conclusions. They were a quiet people, used to seeing all kinds of sorrow pass through. No one asked questions. On the 7th morning, the snow was falling again, a fine, relentless powder. Lillian found Everett in the corral, shirtless despite the bitter cold, his muscles flexing under a dusting of white as he mended a broken fence rail. A man of quiet purpose and formidable strength. She paused near the post arms folded tightly against the chill, a new kind of wariness settling in her heart. You keep feeding us, she said, her voice low. You ain't asked for anything. He drove a nail with a single powerful hammer, strike the sound sharp and clean in the cold air. I don't want anything. He didn't look up. I don't believe that, she said, her voice trembling slightly, not from cold, but from a growing, unsettling anxiety. Nobody just gives. He stopped, his hammer resting on the rail. He turned slowly to face her, his gaze intense. You think I'm like the man you left? Lillian swallowed hard, the taste of her own fear bitter on her tongue. I think most men are hungry for something, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And when a woman is alone, they think that means she's available for whatever they're hungry for. Everett wiped his hands on his worn jeans, the gesture deliberate. He stepped closer, not threateningly, but with a quiet, powerful presence that made her breath catch. I think you're tired, Lillian, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I think you're scared, and I think you don't trust easy. But I am not here to take anything. I just want to see you breathe without flinching. Lillian blinked, a sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. Her throat felt tight, a knot of old pain and new terrifying hope. Just then, Leo ran up, a small, vibrant splash of color in the monochrome world. Mama, look what I got. He laughed, a handful of bright frozen feathers clutched in his mittened hand. She knelt, catching him and holding him close, burying her face in his small, warm neck. Over his shoulder, her eyes met Everett's. Something quiet and profound passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that she was beginning to believe him. That night, she stood beside the fire while Leo slept soundly in the cot. Everett came in from the cold, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. She didn't take it at first. You're the first man who never tried to touch me, she said, her voice raw with a decade's worth of unshed tears. Not once. I wanted to, he said honestly, his gaze unwavering. But only when you wanted me to. Silence stretched between them, a vast, heavy thing. She looked at the stars winking through the barn's gaps in the roof. I was 16 when I had Leo, she said, the words tumbling out of her like stones from a loosened wall. His father left. Then came others. Men who said they would help, but they all wanted something. Everett stepped closer but didn't touch her. I'm not like them. I don't know if I can believe that yet, she whispered, her voice cracking. That's all right, he said. I'll wait. Lillian turned her hand, brushing his knuckles. He didn't grab her. He just stood there steady as a post in the ground, and for the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of safety. The snow came down harder and stayed. It was a cold, unforgiving winter, and the barn became less a shelter and more a life raft. Everett, ever quiet and thoughtful, insisted that she and Leo sleep inside the tack room, a small space where a wood stove he'd salvaged and repaired kept the worst of the cold at bay. He had offered the cot without comment, without pity. Lillian had accepted it because the frozen ground was no longer an option. One evening, Everett came up the path, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind, a sack over his shoulder. He set it down on the bench outside the tack room door. Traded some harness oil for flour, he said, his breath fogging in the lantern light. Also got some dried apples and a tin of lye soap. Lillian nodded, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. I can make biscuits tonight. Leo will like that. She was scrubbing out a water barrel, her arms damp to the elbows. He watched her for a moment, her movements quick and efficient. You always work like it's a race. Idle hands get noticed, she said, a bitter, hard-learned lesson in her voice. Not by me, he said simply. She glanced up, a flicker of something in her eyes. I don't know what to do with someone like you. Everett sat beside the sack, stretching out one leg. You don't have to do anything. That's the problem, she said, her voice quieter, now vulnerable. When nothing's expected, I start waiting for the catch. He looked out toward the distant ridge, where the last light of the sun touched the snow in thin gold streaks. I used to ride for cattle outfits, he said, his voice a low, faraway rumble. South as Texas, north up into Montana. 10 years of bad coffee and worse company. You learn to sleep light and trust nobody. Lillian leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed the cold, seeping through the thin dress. What changed? My brother died, he said, the words heavy and final. Smallpox in a Cheyenne raid. After that, I didn't want to keep riding. Found this job and I've stayed. He didn't offer anymore. She didn't ask. Her eyes drifted to the sack of flour. You didn't have to trade your things for food. I don't need much, he said. And you cook better than I do. That night, the biscuits browned over the cast iron plate. Leo slept, curled in a quilt, his small body finally at peace. Lillian sat on a stool near the stove, rubbing a persistent knot from her shoulder, her hands still raw from work. Everett pulled a chair forward, the legs scraping softly on the wood floor. I found a man today who knew your name. He said, his words a gentle stone dropped into a quiet pool. Her fingers froze over her collarbone, a sharp intake of breath. He didn't ask questions, Everett added quickly. Just said he'd seen you passing through Fort Wiki a few weeks back. I told him nothing. Lillian's jaw tightened. Was he tall? Wore a bowler hat. No hat. Shorter than me. Missing a tooth. She exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping, a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her. Then he's not the one. You want me to keep my eyes open? She nodded once, a quick, sharp motion. I don't want trouble here. You've been good to us. You're not trouble, he said, his voice hard. He is. She looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his. You don't even know him. I don't need to. You came here with nothing but a boy and bruises. That's all I need to know. The stove ticked as the fire settled. She turned the biscuits, her voice coming low, almost lost to the sounds of the fire. I was engaged once before Leo. He was a tanner's apprentice. We were young. I thought that meant something. Everett didn't answer. He just waited, his presence a steady, quiet anchor. He left when I started showing. Claimed it wasn't his. The town believed him. I had to run. You didn't deserve that. No woman does, he said, his voice a low rumble of pure conviction. But most of us have to survive it anyway. She stood and handed him a biscuit wrapped in a cloth napkin. You're different, she said, her eyes searching his. But I still don't know what you want. I want to build something that holds, he said, the words quiet, but filled with a deep, resonant certainty. A life, not just a place to sleep. Lillian looked at him, biscuit in hand, the firelight warm on her face. And you think I'm part of that? I do. She studied him for a long, heavy moment, then sat back down. I still don't trust it. You don't have to, he said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'll keep showing up. Lillian broke the biscuit in two, the steam curling out into the cold air. She handed him half. Then sit down, she said, a small, fragile piece settling over her. You may as well eat with us. The deep winter had settled, a bone-crushing cold that seemed to freeze time itself. The roof creaked under a steady wind that had been rising since dawn, tugging at the shutters and groaning through the barn eaves. Inside, the tack room air held the smell of cured leather and hearth smoke, with a faint trace of cedar from the chest Everett had carved years ago when his hands still shook from grief. Lillian was at the workbench, sleeves rolled up, her fingers deft as she stitched up a saddlebag split along the seam. The boy was asleep in the cot, his arms tucked beneath his chest the way he always did when the cold came on hard. Everett sat across from her, his movements slow and methodical, working a wet stone in even strokes against the edge of a blade. You ever think about leaving? She asked, not looking up from her work. Everett raised his head, the blade's edge a glint in the lamplight. Where would I go? There are places with more trees than people, she said, the needle pulling through the tough leather. Places where folks don't ask how you got your scars. He set the blade down, the rasp of the stone falling silent. I'm not afraid of questions. Lillian tied off the thread and bit it clean. But you don't ask any either, she said quietly. Not even when you should. I don't look at a wound and ask how deep it goes, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I wait for the one wearing it to tell me if they want it seen. She met his eyes, then a raw, exposed edge to her patience. I kept a man's secrets once. He said they weren't mine to carry, but he made sure I carried them anyway. You're not carrying mine, Everett said. But I'll hold yours if you hand them over. Lillian's fingers stilled over the leather. The secrets, the pain, the shame, they felt so real, so heavy. I used to think if I worked hard enough, prayed hard enough, maybe life would soften. She took a deep breath, the air in the small room feeling suddenly thin. Then I realized life doesn't soften. It just changes shape, gets heavier in different places. Everett leaned back in his chair, the legs creaking under his weight. You're still standing. Barely. That counts for something. There was a long pause. The wind pressed against the walls and a loose board rattled in the rafters. The dam holding back a lifetime of pain broke and the words spilled out. I was married once, she said, her voice trembling. Not to Leo's father. Another man. Brief. He waited, a silent, steady listener. He drank. Not always. But when he did, he changed. I left before he could teach Leo how to become him. Everett didn't nod, didn't offer false comfort. He just sat there steady as stone, letting her speak. I don't want Leo to grow up thinking a man's worth is in how loud he talks. I want him to know what quiet strength looks like. He won't, Everett said, his gaze fixed on the sleeping boy. He's watching you more than anyone. He dreams better when he's not hungry. He stood, moved to the stove, and poured the last of the coffee into 2 tin cups. I can add a room to the barn, he said, his words coming slow and deliberate. Put in a small stove. A door that locks. It wouldn't be much, but it would be yours. You wouldn't owe me. She didn't take the cup right away. Why, she asked, a profound disbelieving ache in her throat. I've seen what it looks like when someone takes everything from a woman and smiles doing it, he said, his eyes darkening with a memory of his own. I don't want to see that anymore. Lillian reached for the cup, her fingers brushing his. I'm not used to being offered things without a ledger behind it. There's no ledger. She took a sip, her eyes on the fire. He asked me to lie for him once, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Said the bruises weren't real, that I'd imagined them, that I was too dramatic. Everett's jaw flexed, a muscle tensing in his cheek. You don't have to explain. I want to, she said, her voice rising with a sudden fierce resolve. Because if I don't say it out loud, I'll start believing it was me who failed. He stepped closer, his presence. A warm, solid wall against her pain. You didn't fail. Lillian looked up, throat tight with emotion. I need to know what you want, Everett, she said, the name sounding foreign yet right on her tongue. Not what you don't want. What do you truly want? He studied her face, the lines of weariness, of fight, of grit. I want to build the kind of place where you don't flinch when someone gets close. Where Leo grows up steady. Where you don't wake up wondering what it'll cost to be safe. Lillian's breath caught. That's not a place, she whispered. That's a kind of love. He didn't flinch. I know. She stood, her eyes level with his, now a silent plea in them. Her hand reached out, fingers curling briefly around his. I don't know how to be in something like that. Then I'll learn with you. He didn't pull her in. He just waited. Lillian leaned forward slowly, her forehead coming to rest against his collarbone. Everett's arms went around her, careful, as if he were holding something incredibly fragile but not broken. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. And for the first time in her life, Lillian didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was beginning. The snow held through late November, a deep, silent blanket over the world. The rhythm of their days had settled into something close to peace, though neither Lillian nor Everett ever dared to name it out loud. It was a fragile thing born of shared labor and unspoken understanding. That morning, Lillian rose before the sun, easing from the cot without waking Leo. She wrapped herself in Everett's spare coat, he'd left it folded by the door the night before, and crossed the yard to check the chicken coop. The hens were restless feathers, puffed against the cold, and she scattered feet, her eyes on the woods above the ridge where tracks had crossed 2 days back. Not deer, not elk. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. At breakfast, Everett leaned against the doorframe while she stirred cornmeal into a pan. Leo sat at the table, his nose buried in a worn primer she'd found tucked inside the barn loft. He was a different boy now, less silent, more full of a quiet joy. You taught him his letters, Everett asked, a faint note of surprise in his voice. Lillian scraped the sides of the bowl clean and set it down to bake. I used to work in a mercantile in Missouri. The owner's wife taught me. Said a woman who could read her own receipts wouldn't get cheated. Everett crossed to the table and picked up the primer after Leo wandered outside to play. You ever think of teaching other children? Lillian raised an eyebrow. In a town like this, the mining camps brought in families, he said. They've got no one steady. They're all passing through just like you were. But you're different. She wiped her hands on her apron. I'm not sure they'd want someone like me. Everett set the book down. You're not who you were when you came through that barn door. You think people will forget what they think they know about me? She asked, a familiar defensiveness rising. No, he said, his gaze steady. But they might learn something different if they see you as you are now. She didn't answer right away. Outside, Leo's laughter rang through the yard as he chased a stray rooster. Lillian leaned against the table, her arms folded, watching the boy. I used to think I was only meant to survive. You were wrong. Everett stepped closer, his presence never urgent, never looming. I don't know how to stop bracing for the next blow, she confessed, her voice tight with fear. You're not alone anymore. She studied his face, the faint scar along his brow, the steady calm he wore like old denim. I'm not sure I know how to belong to something that doesn't ask for pain in return. Everett didn't reach for her. He let the silence settle first. Then, with a profound simplicity, he said, Then let it be simple. You and the boy. The barn, the stove, the sound of my feet on the floor. Her voice caught thick with emotion. And you, if you'll have me. I've never stopped having you, he said. That night while Leo slept, she found Everett on the porch sharpening an axe by lantern light. She took a slow, deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. I think I'd like to teach, she said. If the town will let me. He looked over, his eyes gentle in the lamplight. They will. And I think I'd like to stay, she finished the words, a leap of faith. He set the axe down. You already have. She sat beside him. Her hand found his, her fingers lacing through his, slow and certain. I want a life where Leo grows up knowing what gentle looks like. You're building that now. They sat quiet a long while. The wind had died, and above them, stars scattered across a black sky so wide it made the world feel clean again. Lillian turned to him. You want me for my body, she said, her voice low but clear, her eyes steady on his. He turned to meet her gaze, a faint smile on his lips. No, he said. I want you because you don't beg. She leaned in, her lips brushing his. Not desperate, not uncertain. Just sure in the stillness that followed, nothing more needed to be said. They had already chosen each other, and now at last they knew it. The thaw began in late March, a slow, grudging surrender of winter's grip. Water seeped from the hills in slow rivulets, loosening the frost that had held earth and wood rigid for months. The barn smelled of damp hay and new mud, and the chickens, restless from the long winter, began laying again in earnest. Lillian stood at the window of the cabin's new backroom walls, freshly planked a stove set in the corner, and watched the light change on the ridge. She turned as Everett stepped inside the door, closing behind him with a soft thud. He set down a bundle wrapped in waxcloth. Post-rider came through, he said, unwrapping the package to reveal a stack of paper and a tin of ink. Said the town council wants to meet this week. They're asking about a school. Lillian wiped her hands on her apron, her heart a sudden drum against her ribs. That fast. Word travels when it's needed. He gestured to the paper. They want to see what you've drawn up. I haven't written anything down yet. You don't need to. Just tell them what you told me about how you teach. That's enough. Lillian brushed a curl behind her ear. I was thinking of holding lessons in the chapel. It's quiet most days. You want me to come with you when you speak to them? She looked at him, brow creased with a mix of fear and hope. Would you? Everett nodded. You stood by me when I buried that mule last week, and I reckon this is easier than digging frozen ground. Lillian let out a breath that turned into a laugh, a sound she was just learning to make again. I suppose it is. He stepped closer and reached into his coat pocket. I made something, he said, offering a small wooden brooch carved into the shape of a sunflower, its petals rounded and smooth. She turned it over in her palm. Why? You said once you never had anything given without a price. I wanted to give you something just because I could. Lillian fastened it to her collar. It's beautiful. You are, he said, not expecting a reply. Leo's voice called from outside, Mama. The stream's running. Lillian opened the door and stepped out with Everett following. Leo stood on the bank, his boots soaked, his hands cupped around a frog squirming between his fingers. I'm going to build a raft, he shouted. You'll build a cold if you stay in that water, Lillian called back, grinning. Everett leaned in close. He's got your fire. He's got your steadiness, she said, her voice soft with a love that had bloomed in the cold. That evening they shared supper by lamplight. Leo, wrapped in a dry blanket, dozed beside the hearth. Lillian cleared the dishes while Everett stoked the fire. When she returned to the table, he reached into the cupboard, and pulled out a folded paper tied with twine. "I've been keeping this," he said. "Had it in my saddlebag for years." Lillian untied it carefully, her eyes widening as she read the faded ink. "This is land. 80 acres west of the ridge," he said, his voice low with a mix of hope and vulnerability. "I filed on it before I came here. Meant to build one day. Never had a reason." She touched the paper's edge, a profound tremor in her fingers. "And now, I'd like to build it with you. A house, a fence, a schoolroom if you want one. I want to marry you, Lillian, not because you need it, but because I do." The room went still except for the crackle of the fire. Lillian sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "I've never been asked like that," she said softly. "Not with my name spoken like it mattered." "I love you, Lillian," Everett said, his eyes filled with a raw, honest light. "I've loved you since the day you stood in my barn and didn't fall down." She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip sure and steady. "I want that land," she said. "And I want the house. And I want you." They married in early May under the cottonwoods, where the creek curved behind the chapel. Lillian wore a dress sewn from flour sacks trimmed with lace she'd traded for with eggs. Everett wore his best shirt and boots polished with bear fat. Leo stood between them holding a ring carved from bone and set with a shard of agate. The town gathered in quiet support. No one whispered about her past. No one asked where she'd come from. They only watched as she took Everett's hands and spoke her vows with a voice clear and steady. That summer, the school opened inside the chapel. Lillian taught 6 children, including Leo, who sat in the front row with ink on his fingers and a lilting laugh that filled the rafters. The land west of the ridge bloomed with wildflowers. Everett built the house with his own hands, each board nailed with care. Lillian planted a garden behind it, and Leo built a scarecrow with a crooked grin and a hat 3 sizes too big. They moved in before the first frost, and that first night in their own home, Lillian stood in the doorway of the sleeping room, watching Everett place a quilt over Leo's shoulders. She crossed the floor and slipped into his arms. "This is what I never thought I'd have," she whispered. "A place that stays." Everett kissed the crown of her head. "You built it," he said. They stood there a long while, the quiet around them full and warm. Outside, the wind curled through the valley, gentle and slow, like it had nowhere else to be. Inside, they held each other whole and home at last. The story of Lillian and Everett reminds us that the most precious things in life are not what we own, but the places and people where we feel safe enough to breathe and be our true selves. All of us at some point have faced loss, hardship, or long seasons where survival was our only goal. Like Lillian, it's only when we meet someone who offers respect, listens without judgment, and asks for nothing in return that we realize trust and peace must be nurtured over time. Everett did not rescue Lillian with grand promises, but through small, consistent actions that proved real care carries no conditions. The lesson here is that steady kindness and deep respect can heal wounds that have been there for years, regardless of age or past. For those who have weathered many storms, this is a reminder that it is never too late to begin again, to build a place to stay, not just in the sense of a roof over one's head, but in a relationship where fear can be set down and peace can be found in the quiet rhythm of each day. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.